On this episode, we look at crosswalk flags in Kirkland, Washington. Then we talk with Seattle's Ped Bike Coordinator. Feet First advocates for pedestrians in Seattle. We find out if pedestrians pay their own way. We drop in on the annual meeting of the American Planning Association. A wheelchair user can't push pedestrian buttons. Vancouver, British Columbia has a popular Greenways program. And finally, inconsiderate homeowners create problems for pedestrians. Stay tuned. We're talking with Dave Godfrey, who's a transportation engineering manager with the city of Kirkland, Washington. What are these orange things we're standing next to?
Well, they're an example of our PED flag program, John.
And how long has that been going on?
We started with our first sites in August of '96.
And where'd the idea come from? How did it get started?
Well, one of our citizens came up with it as something she had seen in Japan and thought maybe it'd be something we could use here.
So how does the PED flag work?
Well, a pedestrian comes along, takes a flag from the holder, stops traffic, moves their baby carriage out into the traffic, goes to the other side, and puts the holder back in the slot on the other side.
And so the idea behind the flags are that it's a way of capturing the attention of the driver? Is that?
Yeah, it's just when we started this program, we kind of felt like we had thought of most of the obvious things, and we're just trying to go one step farther. It's just a way for a pedestrian to attract the attention of a driver a little more easily.
What sort of difficulties have you had in implementing the program? I mean, it seems pretty basic, straightforward. Have there been any problems?
Well, we had a few little design changes to the flag holders, and initially we lost quite a few flags to theft. And it took a little bit of time for people to kind of understand exactly what was going on, how to use the flags, and that they were really there, and so on. But in general, it's been a relatively simple program that's had a few problems.
We're talking with Peter Lagerway, who's a pedestrian and bicycle coordinator for the city of Seattle. What does a pedestrian and bicycle coordinator do?
Boy, that's a tough question. A lot. I have about 6 people working for me. And so half of our program is in bicycling, half is in walking pedestrian area. And we build and maintain the facilities where people walk and where people bicycle. So sometimes that means our own crew's doing some of the small improvements, and then of course big capital projects we bid out to private contractors. And of course to do that, you do everything from negotiate buying railroad rights of way to writing grant proposals to doing design, planning, policy work, but also the detailed design work. We do a lot of the design right on our own computers, and then construction. We're out in the field with the contractors, so a little bit of everything.
And half a dozen people on ped and bike issues. Has it always been that big a program? How's it changed over time?
Well, when I started here, it was just 1.5 persons, and we were just doing bicycle-related stuff, and it's just grown over the years. And a lot of it had to do with ICE-T. In 1991, the new federal legislation, Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, came along, and that provided a lot of money for bicycle and pedestrian projects. And with that, our program grew. I think the other thing that changed was the renewed interest on the part of neighborhood groups in pedestrian facilities, particularly. And I think the more you get into neighborhood planning, the more you have citizen involvement, the more you're going to see a shift in terms of money and interest from maybe traditional kinds of projects to more pedestrian and some bike-related projects.
How do the neighborhood groups work in the process here in Seattle?
Well, every neighborhood group is a little bit different, but most recently we've divided the city up into 35 different neighborhood areas, or excuse me, 37, and 35 of them are in residential areas, 2 of them are in industrial areas. Each one of those neighborhood areas, and their geographic areas, has done their own neighborhood plan. And interesting, 35 of the 35 neighborhood plans in residential areas, the number one priority that's been identified as something that needs more resources, more attention, is pedestrian infrastructure. And that means sidewalks, sidewalk replacement, getting people across the street, signalization, fixing sidewalks, street furniture, lighting, trees, that kind of thing. And then also bicycling is mentioned frequently. So very, very interesting outcome when you start doing neighborhood planning.
And how does that neighborhood planning then get translated into things actually getting done?
Well, that's not a straight line process, as you can imagine. Certainly what I do is I go through each one of those 37 neighborhood plans and put a little check mark by anything related to bicycling and walking. And I tabulate them, put them together, and then bring it to the decision makers and say, look, this is what the citizens want, this is what the neighborhood groups want, I've got a list here, I can do it, these are good ideas, and I need the funding. And then I use that to get both local money, but also to back up my grant applications, because when you apply for both federal and state money, usually there's points in there scored as, what's the neighborhood support for this? So if I can show that through a neighborhood planning process, there's a lot of support for this particular project, then it helps me score better and get the money. So I use it very, very directly as a fundraiser, as a way to get resources.
And you've got little projects that can be done quickly, bigger projects that take a long time. Are there different processes for each of those?
Yeah, there are. And I think it's real important to be very aware of the fact that there are very short-term, sort of medium-term and long-term projects. It's real important for momentum to always be putting some product on the street. And that's why you want to be doing some of those short-term things like filling potholes or putting in wheelchair ramps or putting in a bike route sign or putting in a bike rack. Those immediate kind of things where people call in, it gets on the street, it really creates momentum. It also creates a sense that this is a program that gets things done. If you give this program money, they'll spend it, they'll do it. And that's very, very important. It's also important, though, of course, to build the bigger projects, the big capital projects. And it's not uncommon for it to take, say, even 6 years for an idea, where at first it's just an idea. Somebody comes up with it, then it gets into a plan, and then you develop support for it, you get funding for it, you design it, you bid it out, you build it. It takes a while, and that's quite a while. Those projects are very important, too, because we do need the big capital projects. For example, Rails to Trails project, or maybe a big redo of a street with sidewalks and things. But I guess the point is, don't rely just on those projects. You need to do those, and you need to do the short ones also.
Seattle's part of a larger metropolitan area. Do you find that you have to work much with the other jurisdictions, or is more this local within the city?
Well, in a day-to-day sense, no. We don't need to work a lot with the other jurisdictions. I mean, the number of roads that connect Seattle to other jurisdictions are not that many because we have water on most sides. But in more of a general macro sense, absolutely, because a lot of the money we get is state money and federal money. And so if the money is going to continue to flow, it's real important that there be demand and distribution of that money to all jurisdictions. If Seattle is the only recipient of pedestrian or bike money, that money is going to dry up very, very fast. It's very, very important that all the different jurisdictions get good bike projects, good pedestrian projects, so it builds constituency support for keeping that pot of money available. And if that support there is across the board, outside of not only Seattle, but also outside the Puget Sound area statewide, then those programs continue. So one of the things that I do is certainly at the state level to really push for distribution systems that make sure that for example, federal ICE-T and now T21 money is available and funds good projects all over the state of Washington. So in that sense, yeah, it's very important that we all be in this together.
10 years from now, are things going to be more of the same, or do you see more changes in the future?
Well, one of the, I guess, the macro kind of changes that's occurring, I think, all over the United States is decentralization, both of funding and decision making. And so I think what you're going to see is a lot more diversity in terms of different communities having a different vision, having different outcomes, spending their money differently. And so you're going to find some communities spending almost no money promoting bicycling and walking, and there are going to be communities where you simply can't walk. There's no sidewalks, big wide arterial streets. You simply have to get in a motor vehicle to go anywhere. And then there's going to be communities on the other extreme where they put a lot of money into bicycling and walking. For example, in Seattle, it's been city policy already since 1984 not to increase capacity for single occupancy vehicles. So if you start with that premise, it opens up a whole new world. And so I think in Seattle, things are going to get much, much better for bicycling and walking. Also, I should mention transit. We have light rail coming in, and so I'm very optimistic there. And then there'll be communities in the middle. They'll do some, but not a lot. So I think what you're going to get is a lot of really variation, community. And it isn't just between different states. It's going to be different communities within Puget Sound area, for example. So, and then why are some communities going to be different than others? It's a tough one. I think a lot of it has to do with the level of citizen involvement, citizen support. It also has to do with just individuals. You can have all the right programs, all the right policies in place, but if you don't have the right people, it still doesn't happen. It always takes people to make it happen. And one of the things I think we're fortunate in Seattle here is we have just a lot of good people in the right places at the right time making things happen.
We're in Seattle, Washington, talking with Bill Spence with Feet First. What is Feet First?
Well, Feet First is a pedestrian advocacy organization. We focus on the Seattle, we like to say the greater Seattle area, but for now it's pretty much in Seattle, and with hopes of eventually growing.
How'd you get started?
Well, there's a statewide organization here called All-Trans, the Washington Coalition for Transportation Alternatives, which actually just changed their name to Transportation Choices, but that's not really the point. Point is, they had a annual meeting one year, and Nancy Christie of the Willamette Pedestrian Coalition came up and did a presentation about how that group got started and what they've been able to do for the Portland area for pedestrians. And we had a breakout session after that presentation, and a group of us from that point on have been meeting and trying to figure out, hey, how can we get advocacy going here in the Seattle area for pedestrians? There's a need, we've got the desire, so let's make it happen.
So what issues are you looking at now you're getting organized?
Well, we had a voter-approved initiative 2 years ago called Sound Transit, which is, basically it's going to put a light rail system in Seattle area and also extend it down to Tacoma. Also includes commuter rail, extended bus service, that sort of thing. It's a huge initiative, and what we want to do is make sure that when they're putting stations in for both the commuter rail and the light rail, that they're accessible to pedestrians. We think that's going to be the key customer base for them, and we want them to look, half-mile radius, say, around the stations, and be sure they identify the networks that pedestrians are using, make sure they're safe, make sure it's accessible, and we think it's to the benefit of not only the pedestrians but to Sound Transit, because we think the ridership will go up. So that's one of the big initiatives at this point. Another one we're looking at is the City of Seattle is about to review their crosswalk marking policy. And we want to get in and be sure that it's done right. It's the first time it's been done. I say redoing, it's actually the first time it's been done, and one of the few cities actually in the country that is doing it, from my understanding. And so we want to get in and be sure that, that the right intersections, the appropriate crossings are put in place, the appropriate markings, the appropriate signage, and make sure that's codified so that when an engineer goes in to either put a new road in or retrofit a road or look at an existing intersection, that they've got a solid set of guidelines that they can go in and use, and we hope to make it, because of that, we hope that there'll be a lot more safe crossings in Seattle.
We're in Victoria, British Columbia, talking with Todd Littman, who's director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. What is the Institute?
The Victoria Transport Policy Institute is an independent research organization that's dedicated to innovative transportation analysis.
One piece of analysis you did not too long ago looked at the issue of pedestrians and bicycles and the cost of roads. Do pedestrians pay their own way?
Yes, they do. A lot of people assume that because highways are funded through dedicated fuel taxes, that automobile users pay for the roads. Well, actually, local roads are almost entirely funded through local taxes, that is, property taxes and sales taxes that everybody pays regardless of how they travel. As a result, people who drive more than average tend to be subsidized by people who drive less than average, such as people that are primarily pedestrians and cyclists.
How much money is spent on local roads?
Well, the average, according to our research, the average household contributes about $200 to $500 a year in local taxes that are spent on local roads. And so that works out to be several cents per mile driven by a car or ridden by a bicycle or traveled by a pedestrian.
So in essence, it's not the cars subsidizing the pedestrians, but the pedestrians subsidizing the cars.
Right. Pedestrians and cyclists impose far lower costs in terms of roadway costs, what it costs to accommodate a bicyclist or a pedestrian. And they travel a lot less during the course of a year. And so when you look at how much people contribute in taxes and how much roadway costs they impose, it's the pedestrians that are paying far more than their fair share, and people that drive excessively who are paying less, who are contributing less in taxes than the costs they impose.
We're going to focus on that platform. The question really is whether that issue can...
We're in Seattle talking with Michael DeVolio, who's president of the Washington State Chapter of the American Planning Association. What is the APA?
The American Planning Association is an organization of some 30,000 citizen and professional planners who work with cities and counties and in the private sector working to improve the quality of life in America's communities.
You've had something big going on this week. What's been happening?
Yes, we have. Today is the final day of our National Planning Conference, where we have about 6,000 planners from around the country who are here to meet each other, to learn from each other, and to get a sense of the state of the art in the field.
What is it a planner does on a day-to-day basis? What you know, on go to work with your parents' day? What do you see?
That's a hard question to answer because there are so many things that planners do. The majority of our membership works in the public sector, working for cities or counties or special purpose districts such as school district or port districts. Many of us work in the private sector, in consulting firms or with engineering firms or law firms. Planners basically help decision makers try to make good decisions.
There's been a lot of talk in recent years about walkable communities. What role would planners play in creating walkable communities?
Planners play a pretty important role in that respect. We do a lot of work in terms of developing long-range solutions dealing with a more global aspect of transportation that would include not just motorized transportation but non-motorized transportation as well. We try to make sure that when a new road is built, for example, that we look at the impacts of that action and make sure that there's enough space there to accommodate all kinds of transportation, such as cycling, such as pedestrians, and lastly, motorized vehicles as well.
Why don't you start out and then we can hear from Mary, Lucy again, and then move on.
We're in Seattle talking with Jeff Soul, who's Policy Director for the American Planning Association. What are the big issues you're looking at now?
Well, it's basically two things. One is that T21, which provided the funding from the federal government for transportation planning last year, now has to be implemented in communities all across America. And planners are working to ensure that pedestrians, bikes, historic preservation, scenic easements, all the different aspects of transportation are incorporated at the local and state levels. And the second thing is that we're working very hard to make sure that open space conservation legislation, as well as historic preservation legislation, provides resources for communities to provide open space while enhancing existing communities, strengthening existing communities.
What are some of the aspects of T21, Transportation Efficiency Act, that have to be kept an eye on, so to speak?
Well, every state, historically, the states have been interested in highway funding. And so over the last 6 to 8 years, they've been more interested in providing livability and looking at livability issues. But we have to, as planners, constantly maintain a balance between the needs of the automobile, the needs of the community. So those are things that we're always looking out for, always trying to make sure that we're building walkable communities, building communities where the automobile is a servant rather than the master.
And what sort of assistance can you give your members to help them in this?
Well, we provide policy guides to the chapters to work with their state departments of transportation. We provide lots of research and publications through our research office in Chicago. So there's technical information, and then there's also what I would consider legislative or advocacy kinds of information to help them at the political level to make sure that it's a balanced approach.
If people wanted to find out more about the APA, do you have a website?
Yeah, we do actually, and it's www.planning.org. There's lots of good information to find out about making livable communities.
We're in Shoreline, Washington, talking with Crystal Chrome. What sort of troubles did you have getting around your neighborhood in your wheelchair?
Crossing busy streets and access public transportation and where there's buttons that you have to push in order to get the light to change for pedestrians. I'm obviously paralyzed from the neck down, not able to get to the pedestrian button, and so I just make a wild guess at when to cross. Like when the traffic's not moving, I move, and I never know what the signal's telling the drivers and the cars, and I feel like I'm playing chicken. And
What did you do then to try to make the buttons accessible to you?
I looked up in the yellow pages a number to call and got an address to the Civil Rights and Compliance, and I wrote a letter, and 2 years later, after a lot of research and bureaucracy and development, the engineers came up with some wheelchair detectors that they put so far at one intersection and plan to put at another one soon, that they just bury a coil under the curb and mark the curb mark a spot on the sidewalk where I'm to put my chair, and it acts like a magnet and sends a message up to the pedestrian button that changes the light, and so I can independently have the light change.
How's that worked for you?
Wonderful. I feel more independent. I feel safer. I felt safer earlier jaywalking at where traffic was only going two ways and there was a turn lane in the middle. And now I feel much safer at this one particular intersection.
We're in Vancouver talking with Alan Duncan, who's a planner with the Greenways program. What is the Greenways program?
The Greenways program is a plan to enhance pedestrian routes across and around the city. There are two components. One is the citywide network, of which there are 14 approved routes, which we're just beginning to build. Some of the existing seaside route, the seawall, are already sections of the Greenways network. There are in place. About 50% of the Greenways network will be on street, where we'll be retrofitting existing streets to make them more pedestrian and cyclist friendly. And when we say cyclist friendly, thinking of, a family who wants to go out for an outing on the weekend with the kids, not just commuter cycling. The other component is what we call neighborhood greenways, and this is Prince Albert Neighborhood Greenway. And neighborhood greenways are different. They can be very small and not necessarily be part of a larger network, but can make a more localized connection or provide more of a local focal point or recreational area. And I think this one's typical, and it was initiated by some residents on this street who were having difficulties with people cutting through. This used to be a lane, a kind of a derelict lane. People were cutting through here because of a larger arterial that just cuts across in a diagonal here. So we closed the lane and turned it into kind of a linear parkette. We tried to combine other programs in its development, like the benches, which were funded through our public art program. And we convinced the church here to put in rain barrels as part of our downspout disconnect program. But what also sets us apart from park is that it's not a park, it's on a city road right-of-way, and it was planted by the community and it's maintained by the community. We come in to fix any big things that need requiring, but basic day-to-day maintenance is handled by the people who live here.
How popular has this been? How many of these little small local greenways do you have now?
We've built probably a dozen, and we have a number of them in the works. Some of them take a lot longer because of the community involvement. Sometimes because we're often responding to problems that the community has, it takes longer to solve the problem. Some we've created them because the city created the problem. Others, there are other organizations or agencies or historical reasons why they're a bit difficult. So some of them take longer, but we have quite a number in the works right now.
There's a problem in a lot of places where homeowners allow their shrubbery to grow out over the sidewalk and block the path of pedestrians. But we have a problem here that's even worse. This is a poison ivy vine growing out over the sidewalk. Pedestrian walking by here brushes against it. It's going to develop a nasty rash when they get home. Homeowners should keep vegetation of all types cut back well away from the edge of the sidewalk. We'll all be happier for it.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.